Here we are in session number 104, entitled Disciples Go Fishing. And we're taking the text from John 28, verses 1 through 14. So this is apparently after the disciples had left Jerusalem and gone to Galilee, as the angels had told the women that if the disciples would go to Galilee, Jesus would meet them there. So what happened after the disciples left Jerusalem to go to Galilee? What happened to Peter's commitment to follow Jesus? How did Jesus intervene in the situation? Well, John 20, 30, and 31 spells out John's purpose in writing his gospel. It would have been a very natural end to it. What follows after verse 31 might be treated as an epilogue or appendix. John 1, 1 to 18 is in effect a prologue, an introduction to the book, to what was to be reported on the life of Jesus. And then in 1:19 on through 20:31 is the report that John gives us of that life. John is telling us who Jesus was as the Son of God, as God the Son. And so then the rest of chapter 21 then is the epilogue. So chapter 20, verse 31, ends the typical meaty portion of John's gospel. And in chapter 21, he wraps it up with the epilogue, which is to balance off the prologue introducing the book. So in chapter 21, we're going to travel to Galilee. We're going to witness Jesus as his next recorded appearance, and it's going to be to a few disciples who had headed out to fish. Interestingly, John's gospel focused primarily on Jesus' Judea ministry. All the others focused on his Galilean ministry. Yet he's the only writer to speak of this episode near the end of Jesus' ministry, his time on earth, where he in fact met with the disciples in Galilee. Well, John, who concentrated on Judea, now is the only one to speak of Galilee. The contrast between John and the synoptic writers, they were, seems even greater in light of the synoptics' emphasis on Jesus' Galilee ministry, almost to the exclusion of the Judean work that John mentioned. Of course, maybe that's why John took that route. We don't know the precise timing of this episode, but it was likely sometime, maybe days, maybe weeks, after Thomas' confession, more than a week after the resurrection. Remember, this would be where Thomas came in and Jesus told him to touch me, put your hands here. And Thomas made his confession, my God and my Savior. What we don't know is the reason for the disciples leaving Jerusalem, except that Jesus had originally ordered it through the angels. Perhaps it was because Jesus had commanded it. Maybe it was out of fear of the Sanhedrin. They wanted to get out of Jerusalem. Perhaps they were about to revert to their PC days, pre-Christ days, pre-Jesus time as commercial fishermen. We don't know, but we suspect that when they say we're going fishing, they weren't talking about grabbing a pole and headed down to the lake to do a little trout fishing. John 21, first 2 verses. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, all the same. Now this is how he did so. Simon Peter, Thomas, called Didymus, Nathanael, who was from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were his together. So out of the 11, here are 7 named disciples. Well, 5 named and 2 not named, but there's 7 of the 11 are here in this group. That would be at least the 7th appearance of Jesus and the 4th one to 1 or more of the 11. So Jesus has been concentrating on his closest disciples. It seems a likely possibility that Andrew and Philip were the 2 unnamed disciples, but we're not told. So that's just speculation on my part or anybody's part, actually. No, well, we're also not told why John names the one he did name. Why did he just say? Well, there are 7 disciples who were going fishing. Where did the other 4 of the original, where were they? There are 4 of the 11 missing. We're not told specifically who is missing. We could come up with 6 names for the 4 if we really wanted to. You might do that out of curiosity. We're not told where they are, by the way, or what they're doing, or why they weren't here. Let's see what was on the mind of the 7, though, who were here. This is John, the first part of 21:3. Simon Peter told him, I'm going fishing. Now, the way he says this implies he's going commercial fishing. And the others said, we'll go with you, they replied. So why did Peter decide to go fishing? We don't know. We do know that Peter's intent was to fish commercially, at night with nets, not hook and line, as some have speculated. Nervous energy? Could be. Current need for income? Could be. Jesus is not around to provide their income anymore, although they have seen him. Know he is risen. Are they killing time until Jesus reappears? Maybe. Were they having a weakening of their commitment or loss of direction in Jesus' absence? We don't know. Even though they'd seen him post-resurrection, but they still could have not seen things to return to the way they were when he was walking among them. We don't know whether Jesus had given them a to-do list before this time. We do know that this was not the first time Peter had returned to commercial fishing after his original contact with Jesus and John the Baptist at the Jordan River. So Peter had gotten introduced to Jesus through Andrew, his brother, there along the Jordan River. And after his, was it before or after his temptation? Well, go look that up if you will. But this had happened And so we're sometime later than that. But then later in John, we see that Jesus came along and told them, come on, follow me. They were commercially fishing after the John the Baptist introduction. So Peter had returned at least one other time to commercial fishing, and appears as though he's doing it again here. He may have felt under a cloud because of his 3 denials, but since that's a little bit edgy perhaps, because remember, Jesus met with Jesus Resurrection Sunday afternoon sometime. So, in spite of that personal visit with Jesus, it may have been that, and he was there on Sunday evening when Jesus met with the 10, and the following week he had met with all 11, Jesus had. So Peter has seen Jesus at least 3 times. He was still the leader of the 11, and 6 of them were with him here. But then the best laid plans, was it of mice and men or whatever, in the second half of John 21:3, they, the 7, went out and got into the boat that night. That's the clue that they're commercially fishing. They caught nada. They caught nothing. So recall that catching nothing at night wasn't new to Peter. He'd been through that with Jesus before. Doesn't this also sound familiar? Where did a similar event take place? It was sometime after Peter's original call. He was evidently still in the fishing trade, and Jesus was teaching. Jesus borrowed Peter's boat to use it as a pulpit. Remember that? And then after that, they have a miraculous catch as described in Luke 5:1-11. So Peter's been through this before. And now Jesus steps in again. Look at John 21, verses 4 and 5. When it was already very early morning, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know it was Jesus. Here's another situation where some reason, at times, they don't recognize him. So Jesus said to them, he must have called across the water, "Children, you don't have any fish, do you?" I don't think he was rubbing it in. And they replied, "No, we don't." Doesn't, again, that sound familiar? They didn't recognize Jesus, even when he spoke to them. Who else had that same problem? Well, remember Mary Magdalene outside the tomb when Jesus spoke to her? She didn't recognize his voice until he said, "Mary." Then she did. Cleopas and his friend on the Emmaus Road, they didn't recognize Jesus either. So there have been several instances where Jesus wasn't quickly recognized, even when he spoke. Now, Jesus knew that they had nothing to show for their night of labor. Could he have been responsible for the no-catch results? You ever stop and think that if Jesus can produce a miracle catch, he can absolutely cut off any catch also? I don't know whether people typically think about that. And they say, well, Jesus would never cut off the fish from them. How do you know? I don't. I think for his own purposes, he might have prevented them from doing anything at night and catching fish because he had something in mind. He knew they had nothing to show for the night of labor. He could have been responsible for the no catch. It could be, and God has the power to channel events in order to move his people where he wants them for the purposes he wants them there. But we're not told whether that was this case or not. The point, God may do some things we don't like, but if it's for his will and is therefore good. There are lots of things. We're getting ready on Sunday mornings to talk about the attributes of God. And we're going to find that there are lots of things at the extreme edge of some of God's attributes where he might do things we don't like. We don't know he will, but the question is, if he does something that is consistent with his attributes and his holiness, can you permit God to do that? Or are you saying, that's not the God I worship? Stop and think about that, because if you say, no, I can't worship a God who does that, the God you worship is an idol. Let's go again back to John 21. Try to stay on target here a bit. John 21:6. He, Jesus, told them, throw your net on the right side of the boat. Boy, they heard that before. And you will find some. Fish, of course. So they threw the net and were not able to pull it in because of the large number of fish. And if I remember, it was a large number of large fish. Do you think anyone caught on as to what's going on? Why do you think they bothered to do as Jesus suggested? Or were they beginning to get some inklings of who this guy was standing on the beach hollering at them, rubbing it in that they hadn't caught anything all night? Well, look at verse 7. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, we take that to be John, he said to Peter, it's the Lord. So Simon Peter, when he heard that it was the Lord, tucked in his outer garment, for he had nothing on underneath it, and plunged into the sea. Peter responded, dives in. John seems to have been the first to recognize Jesus because probably he remembered the nature of the earlier catch. Remember, he and his brother James and the father Zebedee were all part of that second call. Simon Peter, still Simon Peter. Never forget that. Note that Jesus called him Simon Peter, not simply Peter. Evidently, Peter had a belt of some sort. How else would he have tucked in his outer garment? Because if he just rolled it up inside the other outer part of his garment and dive in to the water, that diving would probably undone everything. Anyhow, Peter's impulsive reply seems to imply that he and Jesus had reconciled to some degree during Jesus' Sunday afternoon visit after the resurrection. In any regard, Peter's swimsuit was a strange thing to behold. Was this the first time Peter went overside? No. He once walked on water, remember, for a very short distance, but some distance. While he was swimming to shore, what happened? Well, there's verse 8 of John 21. Meanwhile, the other disciples came with the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from land, only about 100 yards. Football field, right? The estimate of 100 yards evidently represented a a veteran fisherman's eyewitness recollection. As they got to shore, John 21:9 and 10, when they got out on the beach, they saw a charcoal fire ready with a fish placed on it already, and bread. Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish you just now caught." So where had Peter seen Jesus with loaves and fishes before? How about it? The feeding of the 5,000 in John 6 and the 4,000 in Matthew 15. So Peter had seen Jesus with loaves and fishes before, a couple times. Now, Jesus had only a single fish, but they had a load of them, right? It says many of them. Jesus had already prepared a meal for them, although the single fish likely wouldn't feed the 7 plus Jesus. Not with a miracle, without a miracle, of course. Where do you think Jesus got the fish he already had? And the bread, for that matter. Where did Jesus, do you think he bought it? Think he had it appear? Think about it. I don't know that it's key to what's going on here. Again, Simon Peter is the first to respond. So Simon Peter went aboard. He went back on the boat, pulled the net to shore. It was full of large fish, 153. But although they were so many, the net was not torn. That may be another miracle. But Peter's out there saying, man, this is a good haul. 153 large fish. Now, Jesus is going to want one or two of those to make breakfast yet, but so here is another eyewitness piece of information. A count on the number of fish and the fact that the net did not tear. Remember before when they had the large miracle catch, the net began to tear. 153 large fish. That's a good commercial haul. Some try to place significance on the number 153. I don't think there's a particular reason to do so. 153 large fish could easily weigh from 500 to 1,000 pounds. Let's see, at 500, it'd be what, 3.5 pounds a piece? 3.5 pound fish isn't a particularly large fish. It's a nice size fish, especially if you catch bluegill like I do, weigh about 10 to the pound or something. So if there were 7-pound fish, then 153 of them could weigh 1,000 pounds. So probably in the range of 500 to 1,000 pounds of fish. The best guess seems to be that 153 is a detail that indicates this is an eyewitness account. This is not hearsay. I actually counted those guys. However, with Jesus, one fish, the total is 154, which is divisible by 7. Right? Well, so what? Okay, you decide that. Some people like to play with the numbers and get involved in those kinds of things. I typically don't, unless there's a real message. The disciples probably received a message, and they also received an invitation they couldn't refuse. That invitation's verse 12, come have breakfast, Jesus said. In Acts 10:41, Jesus eating and drinking post-resurrection is offered as proof of that resurrection. So here Jesus is providing a breakfast for at least 7 other disciples. We find Jesus providing still, after he's died, been buried, and his resurrection, he's still providing for his followers. Okay? And what were the response of the 12, or the 7? But none, this is verse 12, second half of the verse, but none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" Because they knew it was the Lord. That verse has puzzled me a lot. They knew it was the Lord, so why bother asking him? But it says they really were afraid to. Good thing they knew, because otherwise they'd have been eating breakfast with a stranger, right? It seems puzzling again to me. If they knew it was Jesus, why would they want to ask him who he was? Could it have been that they still having difficulty recognizing Jesus in his resurrection body? And would likely have wanted some reassurance. That's really you, isn't it, Lord? Maybe that's what they were after, was they wished they could ask him, "It's you, right?" Another question, did Jesus really need their fish in order to provide a breakfast for the 7? The one fish wasn't enough. But did he need their fish? You got to be kidding, right? It would seem that they actually recognized him this time, though, even though they would have liked some assurance. Verses 13 and 14, Jesus came and took the bread, gave it to them, and did the same with the fish, which is the way he distributed in the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. This was now the 3rd time Jesus was revealed to the disciples as a body after he was raised from the dead. Remember the night of Resurrection Sunday, a week later with Thomas present, and now here for the 3rd time at least. So, what were the other 2 appearances? Well, I just gave them to you, right? Why should I ask my own question after I've just answered? It's a good question. What was I going to say? Oh, John only reports 3 post-resurrection appearances. John doesn't go into the resurrection appearances before Mary Magdalene, before the women, the Emmaus Road. He didn't do any of those. Peter in the afternoon, he doesn't mention that. He only mentions the 3. Sunday night a week later, and now. To the 10 on Resurrection Day, all 11 with Thomas present a week later, and now 7 of them present after a fruitless fishing evening. John didn't include Jesus' afternoon meeting with Peter either. Jesus gave thanks, and then he gave the bread and the fishes to the disciples again, very reminiscent of the way he behaved in the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. But there's a question. Do you think Jesus ate any of the breakfast? Remember, he did eat some fish in the room after the resurrection. As we'll see in our next segment, This meeting had a purpose. It's where Jesus wants to unconditionally reinstate Peter as the leader of his people and to tell Peter what is expected. So that's where we're going to go next, where Jesus repeatedly asks Peter, "Do you love me?" And "Feed my fish." No, "feed my sheep." It doesn't put us down as fish, he puts us down as sheep. We'll see you then, and maybe we'll keep things straight.